the Concours d'Elegance at Pebble Beach, on the Monterey Peninsula of California. It is an annual gathering of the world's greatest automobiles, spanning a century of exceptional design and outstanding engineering. This garden party of the highest order is by invitation only. Pedigree and purity of lineage are the yardsticks with which these priceless classics are measured. They are the blue-chip aristocracy of the motoring world. Amidst the full-fendered elegance and wire-wheeled opulence of the many grand automobiles of the past assembled here, a special display arouses the curiosity of even the most jaded members of the Pebble Beach faithful. These are the automobiles which bear the striking lines and bold curves conjured up within the minds of yesterday's most adventurous designers and engineers. Some lavishly sleek, and others playfully uncomfortable to the eye. These concept cars, or dream cars from the golden age of American style, silently preserve an era of unrestrained imagination. Now, some 4 decades after their birth, the dream cars reveal a fascinating story of boundless ambition and zealous optimism that emerged from the drafting tables of Detroit. Although they were created as pathfinders for the future, history has shown that the future and these intended bellwethers of tomorrow ultimately travel different paths. But the dream cars have succeeded as great rolling archives of automotive innovation, reminding us of the power of the imagination and the visual energy of great design, all of which can be found in these, the dreams of steel. In the very early years of automobile production, style was often no more than a byproduct of function. The individual components of automobiles were called upon to fulfill certain tasks, rather than make design statements. Fenders were required to shield occupants from moisture and dirt thrown up from the wheels. Bodies were required only to offer protection to the driver and passengers. Lights were to provide illumination. Spare tires were strictly a solution to a common problem, tire punctures, and little thought was given to how stylishly they should be mounted. By the 1920s and 30s, premium automobiles had established themselves as expressions of individuality in automotive style and design. The very wealthy could order their new Duesenberg, Auburn, or Cadillac with coachwork custom designed by such craftsmen as Dietrich, Murphy, Kellner, or Molliner. Today, the sensational classic automobiles of these decades continue to draw praise and acclaim as enthusiastically as when they first placed wheel to pavement. During the 30s, innovative style was becoming a priority at General Motors. Harley Earl had come aboard in 1927 as the founder and director of the Art and Color Studios at GM. Drawing from a design background which centered on the creation of customized coachwork for affluent automobile owners in Southern California, his flair for dramatic coach design was the catalyst that triggered GM's interest in him. Between 1927 and 1959, his role in GM's styling leadership and dominance in the marketplace cannot be overstated. For the most part, Earl and his styling contemporaries had always concentrated their energies on exploring glamorous, even extravagant automotive themes, with an emphasis on exclusivity and uniqueness. Styles based on futuristic themes were virtually unheard of. But as the 1930s drew to a close, Harley Earl's vision for tomorrow's automobiles began to emerge. Bill Porter is a veteran stylist for General Motors, responsible for such automotive designs as the 1995 Buick Riviera, and he recalls another Buick of immense historical importance.
Generally speaking, the first General Motors concept car is thought to be the 1939 Y Job. It was actually designed in 1938, but Harley Earl announced it to the public in 1939. And this was a Buick, a two-seater with a sort of a torpedo-shaped body, and it had many innovations on it that would be found in later Buicks. The grille, for instance, very similar to the 1941 Buicks, even though the car appeared in 1939. So the thought was that they would explore advanced thinking and see if the public reaction to it was positive, which of course in the case of the Y job was very positive. And in fact, Buick enjoyed some of its most successful years in the early 40s with motifs that had been used on the Y job.
The Y job, as seen here at Pebble Beach, boasted the industry's first electric top. It featured power windows and a power hood. The fenders extended into the doors. There were no running boards, and the concealed headlights were another Harley Earl innovation. With the arrival of the Buick Y job, the term concept car became a permanent element of the automobile designer's vocabulary.
A concept car is a look into the future to determine the directions that we might be moving in terms of new design for any car we're doing, design-wise and engineering-wise. And it gives us an opportunity to review these cars or display these cars. For the most part, they're displayed. Some concept cars are never shown, but most of them are shown to the public to gauge the consumer reaction.
In many ways, they're precursors to what we may be doing for production. They be just kind of an exercise in serendipity a little bit, where we want to explore a nostalgia theme, or we want to explore a very contemporary theme, or so they're an opportunity for us to express ourselves, an opportunity to really let things out, and they're very useful for that.
Essentially, a concept car, I think, is a car that's not necessarily intended for production, but it's intended to test new ideas, whether they be styling ideas or engineering ideas, or in most cases probably a combination of both.
Shortly after the debut of the Buick Y job, Chrysler designers moved into the realm of the dream car with two styling exercises in 1940, the Chrysler Thunderbolt and the Chrysler Newport.
Those were certainly significant vehicles, and Alex Tremulous was a designer at the time, and in much the same way as today, had worked on that Thunderbolt. And it was a breakthrough for its time. It got rid of the applied fenders. It was a very different body form. The Thunderbolt had a disappearing hard roof. It had the first application of getting rid of the applied fenders. It was a breakthrough in a number of ways, covering the wheels. And it was a very interesting vehicle. The Newport was a very long, a very stretched vehicle. I think it was probably intended as a pace car, if I remember right, but very interesting vehicles, and they were in almost every way a breakthrough from what was the norm of the time. So in essence, they became very important as concept vehicles.
After designing the Chrysler Thunderbolt, Alex Tremulous, both a designer and engineer, would go on to become engineering chief for Preston Tucker and play a significant role in the look and layout of the ill-fated Tucker Torpedo. America's entrance into World War II suspended new car design and manufacturing until almost the end of the 1940s. But with a new decade arriving, Detroit would once again apply itself wholeheartedly to the business of producing the next generation of automobiles. The 1950s had spawned a fresh attitude toward the country's future. Looking ahead was now a vital component of the American dream. This curiosity about the future, combined with Harley Earl's abiding interest in aircraft, resulted in a string of GM dream cars in the 50s that opened new doors in automotive styling. The first was the Buick LeSabre in 1951. Adorned with numerous aircraft styling cues, the LeSabre, which served as Harley Earl's personal transportation for several years, was frequently photographed with Earl seated behind the wheel. The LeSabre featured a dual fuel system, using premium gasoline and methanol to provide extra power. A host of electric and hydraulic convenience features, along with the Earl-inspired rear tail fins, made this dream car an instant sensation. It would become a GM styling centerpiece until 1954. As the dream car phenomenon and the tempo of the 1950s picked up momentum, Harley Earl and GM's top executives pushed ahead with a marketing campaign that helped to revitalize the post-war automobile industry. In the 1930s and 40s, GM had presented a series of industrialist luncheons at New York's Waldorf Astoria. Designed to gather the banking industry's most elite investors and key people from the nation's largest financial and industrial centers, these gala affairs, held in the Waldorf's Grand Ballroom, showcased GM's top-end products from each of its divisions. Throughout the 1950s, GM expanded the concept of the industrialist luncheons into what would be called the GM Motoramas.
The idea was to have a place where people could come. In this case, the Waldorf Astoria Ballroom was selected in New York City. Then concept cars, or show cars as they were called in those days, dream cars, were then created by the design studios, one for each division, and then shown at the Waldorf Astoria amid a tremendous fanfare and stage settings that were, for the time, absolutely incredible. Giant arms would lift automobiles from the stage and swing them out with, of course, choruses of people singing and dancing and so on. It was really an incredible full-fledged type production, Hollywood and Broadway sort of combined. And of course the response by the public to these very dramatic cars, often with wild new ideas, was indeed tremendous. People talked about it, and then there was a traveling version of the Motorama with no doubt some of the more spectacular stage effects cooled down just a little bit, but the cars went on the road and were everywhere they went. At each city, why, they were greeted by literally tens of thousands of people and a tremendous, tremendous interest.
The GM Motoramas required several arduous months of preparation. Architects and set designers were contracted to conceive and build massive stages, backdrops, and kinetic sculptures. Exhibition halls were transformed into immense dioramas, many times reflecting futuristic themes. The cars themselves would receive hours of patient preparation, polishing, waxing, and careful detailing. It is said that for its debut appearance at the 1951 Motorama, the Buick LeSabre received no less than 200 man-hours of preparation. On move-in day, trailer trucks transported the show vehicles to the show site, and the laborious task of mating vehicles to displays would begin. As the 1953 New York Motorama took shape, much of the operation was personally supervised by GM's division managers, including Harley Earl, seen here posing next to his Buick LeSabre. With singers, dancers, orchestras, sets, and sophisticated displays teaming up on each Motorama, these multi-million-dollar productions easily cost much more than the biggest Broadway show. Slated to tour the country on a 6-month swing, close to 2 million people would ultimately attend these spectacular road shows. In fact, on January 23, 1953, the New York Motorama drew 12,000 visitors, completely disinterested that day to the swearing-in of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And with bookings in at least 6 key American cities from San Francisco to Miami each year throughout the 50s, the traveling Motoramas were the perfect setting for unveiling GM's new product lineups, along with their latest dream cars.
This Chevrolet Corvette and the other customized models are not for sale yet. They were built to give tangible form to the drawing board ideas of today, out of which may grow the shape of things to come. Pontiac's La Parisienne, a modernized version of the traditional landau. Oldsmobile Starfire. This car and 3 of the other customized models have glass fiber reinforced plastic bodies, results of an investigation into the possibilities of plastic impregnated materials as substitutes for steel. Buick's XP300, an experimental car from which many features have already found their way into regular production models. Cadillac's Le Mans, a racy, low-slung convertible built to carry 3 passengers behind a 250-horsepower engine. From road to top of windshield, Le Mans is only 51 inches high. The Sabre, an experimental laboratory on wheels. Surrounded by the best of the cars of today, this preview of the car of tomorrow highlights the Motorama of '53.
And it's my personal opinion. I think that the dream cars of the 50s were not engineering or manufacturing oriented. They were not really customer oriented. They were show oriented. They were attraction. They were very nice styling exercise.
Back in the 50s and the early 50s, when we were accused of designing all these lead sleds and large cars, the Europeans used to call them yank tanks. It's really what the buyers wanted. And let's face it, automotive design is really a reflection of our culture. And that's what our culture was back then.
This was a period of tremendous optimism in America. Expanding economy, a boom period. Americans were moving to the suburbs. Articles in magazines and so on talked about, it wouldn't be too long until you'd have an airplane in your garage, maybe that the wings folded and you'd drive it out and fly to work, or maybe a helicopter. This kind of, well, the things that popular mechanics and popular science talked about as being in the future, and other magazines and so on picked up too, were virtually everybody's dream. It was almost in your pocket that you'd be able to have these wonderful cars that would ride on automated highways or your own helicopter in the garage. This was the era of exuberance and optimism. And the cars, the concept cars, of course, reflected it, as did many other appliances and so on. GM did their kitchen of tomorrow during this period where the housewife would have electronic ovens and so on at her disposal. The dishwasher was, of course, a dream which became a reality. But some of the dreams never quite got here, as you know, but like the fully automated highways, but that was the era. It was really an era of, I think, incredible exuberance and a wonderful spirit in America. And I think the rest of the world looked at us at that time for this kind of direction. Anyone in those days, I think, anyone who could get to America probably wanted to come here. There was that kind of feeling everywhere.
At the 1954 GM Motorama in Miami, a revolutionary dream car was unveiled to an awestruck public that would boldly usher in the most profound statement of future think Detroit had yet to conceive. The Firebird 1 was the first of 3 Firebird concepts to be built by General Motors. Its earthbound fighter plane configuration, right down to its control stick throttle and steering systems, easily made it a technological wonder of its time. The GM Firebird 2, designed by Norman James, debuted in 1956. And the Firebird 3, also a Norman James design, was unveiled in 1958. All 3 powered by the industry's first automotive application of the gasoline turbine engine.
The turbine engine, in the meantime, as a jet fighter plane engine, had been developed right at the very end of the war. You know, the Germans had one just at the very end of the war, and we did too, although they didn't see action in World War II. But Harley Earl was fascinated with aircraft. By this time, he was totally taken with them, and not surprisingly, why the turbine engine was adapted to automotive use. And by 1953, when the first Firebird 1 came out, the actual aircraft-type turbine had been applied to an automobile design. And the car that you see behind me then is the first application in America of the aircraft-type turbine to an automobile. And of course, it looks virtually like a fighter plane on wheels, which in fact it is. This is a non-regenerative turbine, and if you were to stand behind it when the engine was running, you would get some pretty hot ankles. So our Firebird 2 then, which succeeded this, and then the Firebird 3, were more, shall we say, civilized automobiles where the engine used was a regenerative turbine and the exhaust was much cooler and it was much more suitable for street use. This car, the Firebird 1, was actually tested at the desert proving grounds out near Mesa, Arizona, by Indy driver Maury Rose, and was a very fast car indeed. I believe, in fact, it was briefly the fastest turbine-powered car in the world. The Firebird 2, as you know, had a titanium body, which was a radical new metal at that time, much stronger than steel, which Harley wanted to, which he wanted to look at. And Bob McLean and the engineering group there, of course, were intensely interested in its possibilities for the industry because it was so incredibly strong. So the Firebird 2 was an experiment in the use of titanium. The Firebird 3, I think, is, in my view, is perhaps the most dramatic of all show cars. It's the all-time show car for me. And Norm told me one time that Harley had come in the studio and was talking to them about it, and he said, there's going to be big crowds at the Waldorf Astoria around this car. I'd like to have a car. You design me a car that you can, if you could be at the back of the crowd standing on tiptoes, you could still see this car. And of course, I guess Norm mulled this over for some time and of course came up with the idea of this sort of wedge flat fuselage thing with these gigantic fins, you know. I think I counted 9 fins on that car at one time. It's just bristling with fins. And of course it has a sort of a double bubble cockpit. And the fins, you know, while they're of course exuberant and all that, nevertheless, if you look at them closely, they're absolutely exquisite. They're beautifully, absolutely beautifully conceived. Up to that time, Harley Earl had been preoccupied with shapes that obeyed what he referred to as his highlight rules. In other words, they had to be sort of sausage shapes that when the light reflected on them, the reflections would carry along the full length of the car. And of course, these could be measured with little gauges that the model makers had with protractors on them and little bubbles, and they'd come in and make sure that the highlights checked out the whole length of the car. Norm just wiped away those rules. He just blew them completely. The highlights on the fins of the Firebird 3 ran all over the place, but the car looked wonderful.
The Firebird probably was a very significant concept car. It never, they never really built anything in production that came close to it, except a lot of the fins that were on the first Firebird did start to appear on a number of the Cadillacs and other GM cars. But even before the Firebird, back in the early 50s, GM had a number of concept cars. I think they were the first ones to do concept cars back then.
While GM was playing to receptive Motorama audiences during this hotbed of dream car design, another giant of automotive style was forging his own trail of creative brilliance at Chrysler. Virgil Exner, who had worked with Harley Earl at GM in the 30s and later with the legendary Raymond Loewy at Studebaker in the mid-40s, joined the Chrysler design team in 1949. His forward-look styling theme of the 1950s earned the Chrysler product line critical acclaim, and his series of Chrysler dream cars, many built in Italy at the design house of Ghia, brought daring new shapes to the concept arena.
In my opinion, the most significant, the most lasting cars that I think really withstood the test of time were some of the ones that were done by Virgil Exner. And he did them at Ghia in Turin, Italy, which is now a Ford operation. And one of the most beautiful ones he did was a Dart. And he did a DeSoto. I don't recall the name of the DeSoto, but it went down with the Andrea Doria back a number of years ago when it was so, it never saw the show circuit. It went down when it was being shipped over to the United States from the Ghia Carrozzeria in Turin, Italy. But those were very significant. I think that Virgil Exner probably did some of the most significant concept cars, which are still lasting today, I think.
The Chrysler Norseman, a sleek aluminum-bodied dream car, was on its way to America from Italy on July 26, 1956, aboard the Italian liner Andrea Doria. The car was lost when the Andrea Doria collided with the liner Stockholm off the coast of Cape Cod and sank in 200 feet of water in the North Atlantic. But numerous concept cars from the imagination of Virgil Exner have gone on to become automotive design hallmarks. The 1952 Chrysler C200, the 1953 Chrysler Special, the 1953 DeSoto Adventurer 1, the 1953 Chrysler d'Elegance, the 1954 DeSoto Adventurer 2, the 1954 Dodge Fire Arrow 1, and Fire Arrow 2, the Fire Arrow Sport Coupe and Fire Arrow Convertible, and the 1956 Dodge Dart. At Ford, there was less emphasis placed on the design and creation of dream cars in the 1950s than at GM or Chrysler. However, designers such as Frank Hershey and John Nadger conceived several wildly futuristic concepts during that decade, such as the 1955 Lincoln Futura, which would eventually serve as the platform for the Batmobile, used on the ABC television series Batman from 1966 to 1968. There was the ultra-radical Ford Nucleon, a bizarre styling exercise characterized by both of its axles set back on the platform to help bear the weight of the Nucleon's power plant, a nuclear reactor. The Ford Volante was the industry's first attempt at designing a wheelless automobile, deriving its mobility from horizontally mounted fans, similar to today's hovercrafts. With a free hand to let their imaginations run to the outrageous, many of the dream car designers of the 50s and 60s often exceeded the limits of feasibility and entered the uncharted waters of the improbable. And yet, predicting the future has never been an exact science.
Some of the things have been pretty outrageous over the years, and I think back to the 60s when we were predicting the jet age, and you look at all of the forms, especially the aircraft-inspired forms. Generally, there was some kind of an influence that you could trace this back to. I don't see it being quite as radical today, or quite as expressive in the sense that by the year whatever, people were predicting 100 years out, they would say, they aren't going to have tires, or they aren't going to, today, I don't think we get lost in trying to reach that far. I think if we can do a good job looking at the next 5 or 6 years, we're doing pretty good, as opposed to trying to look much further. The crystal ball gets pretty cloudy that far out, and the ones that tend to look the silliest today are the ones that probably tried to predict a little bit too far. And that's not saying we shouldn't do that, but we should just be willing to accept the consequences, that they're probably going to look a little strange when the time finally arrives.
I got into the business in the late 50s, and at that time we were still doing a number of concept cars that did reach, but they weren't necessarily feasible in terms of overall package and function and production feasibility, whereas today the cars that we're doing at Ford are much more predictable. They're predictors of the future, and rather than just being a very way out reachy type stretch design, I think they're much more functional. They're much more realistic in terms of production feasibility and function and engineering. So they're much more serious attempts at looking at the future than they were back in the 50s. Although I think in both cases, in the 50s and today, we were always looking into the future. It's just that we're looking more seriously now, and we have the technology that allows us to be more serious with the cars today. With computer technology, we can go through much more simulation to predict the actual performance, the dynamics of the car. We didn't have any of that available to us, say, 15 or 20 years ago.
Possibly because I think this incredible naive exuberance of the late 40s and 50s maybe isn't with us today. We're a little more perhaps drawn in, we're a little more introspective today. Maybe you could say we're a little more realistic, perhaps. And I think, too, a number of companies have taken to the notion of introducing concept cars as a way of, shall I say, doing a little downfield blocking for their future products. In other words, rather than the concept car being totally exploratory and actually reaching way beyond their current product lineup, the concept cars actually become almost a means of introducing their product or the ideas in their products a year or two in advance to warm the public up to them. And that's a totally different take on the concept car than, say, the Harley Earl take, which was, of course, to be highly experimental and just reach out as far as you possibly could.
As the freewheeling 50s motored on, the stream of dream cars rolling from Detroit's Big Three kept America's auto-buying public thoroughly entertained with grand images of things hopefully to come. The 1953 Ford XL 500 featured a push-button transmission, a telephone, and dictaphone, plus electric jacks to raise the car for tire changing. The 1954 Buick Wildcat II, unveiled at the 1954 GM Motorama, was featured in a GM promotional film starring GM President Harlow Curtis. The 1954 Ford Atmos, purely a styling exercise, it was engineless, but was the first Detroit dream car to come equipped with an onboard radar screen. The 1954 Pontiac Bonneville Special. Although similar in appearance to the 1954 Corvette, they shared no interchangeable parts. The 1956 Pontiac Club de Mer, which sat a remarkably low 38 inches high and was built of hand-formed aluminum. And the 1959 Cadillac Cyclone, equipped with dual radar pods on its two front nose cones, would signal the driver of objects in its path. Now on exhibit at GM, the Cyclone's unique sliding doors and aircraft styling embodies the flavor of GM's dream car direction in the late 50s. The barrage of dream cars pouring from Detroit began to wind down as the 1960s arrived. The national euphoria of the 50s had been replaced by new sensibilities as the decade changed, and the automobile industry shifted its focus from the distant future to the immediate future. In 1961, Chrysler shook up the automotive status quo with its turbine car. Powered by Chrysler's version of the gas turbine engine, it could be fueled by gasoline, diesel oil, kerosene, or even cooking oil. It required no tune-ups or oil changes and had 80% fewer moving parts than a conventional automobile engine. With controversial styling created by Chrysler designer Elwood Engel, and with a tangible connection with future automotive technologies, 50 turbine cars were built by Chrysler. On a nationwide real-world test in October of 1963, 203 school teachers, housewives, students, and salesmen would drive these cars for 3 years, logging 1 million miles in the process to evaluate the feasibility and durability of the turbine car. The test received international attention, but the turbine car program soon lost favor with Chrysler, and by 1981, the project was scrapped.
I can remember the first time I saw one. I was on college campus, and it was in 1964, and a number of these vehicles were produced and then put out into the general public. And what they were trying to do was find out and research basically the acceptance of a turbine vehicle. And they were very important. They were an important theme. I think they were an opportunity for the designer at the time, Elwood Engel, to express himself. And certainly that came after a period, in the 50s, which was rich in concept cars as well.
The turbine, first of all, the tremendous heat inside of the turbine called for metals, of very, very special metals that had to withstand those high temperatures and retain their exact shape so that the air could pass through them. And I think that the metallurgy alone, the cost of that, precluded their use in automobiles. Also understand that the turbine works best when it's running evenly at very, very high speeds, which of course in a jet aircraft is exactly what happens. When the aircraft gets up to its cruising altitude, the turbine can run then more or less continuously without having to vary its power loadings over a tremendously wide range, such as happens in the automobile. As you go down the average boulevard in America, and every at least quarter of a mile you stop and start, then you pull into residential streets and you're stopping at stop signs every block, the engine and is working up and down, continuously changing. Understand this is not very good for the turbine. The turbine operates much less efficiently that way than it would at continuous speeds.
The Chrysler Design Studios forged ahead with several styling-based dream cars during the early 60s. At the same time, the turbine car was staking Chrysler's claim to technological leadership. One was another turbine-powered exercise. The Chrysler TurboFlight featured a hydraulically raised and lowered canopy and a rear spoiler, which hinted of styling touches yet to come on high-performance vehicles. The Plymouth XNR combined futuristic styling with what was called asymmetrical design, placing scoops, fins, and emblems purposely off-center. In 1962, Lee Iacocca, only 36 years old and general manager of the Ford Motor Company, was very much convinced that baby boomers who were now reaching driving age were looking for a car that targeted their exuberant lifestyle. Ford stylist John Nadger was directed to design a two-seat sports car aimed directly at this new youthful consumer group. In February of 1962, preliminary drawings were completed, and by October of that year, an operational prototype was ready for evaluation. It was unquestionably the most influential concept car of the decade. A mid-engine two-seat roadster with a low-slung suspension and a race car profile, the Mustang I seemed to be a shoo-in for production. But Iacocca soon realized that the market preferred a four-seater, proven by the fact that Ford's four-seat Thunderbirds had been easily outselling the more enthusiast-based two-seat Thunderbirds of the mid-50s. Designer David Ash took the Mustang I concept and made the changes Iacocca had requested. Ash's completed drawings of the Mustang II differed little from the actual production Mustang that debuted on April 17, 1964. In just over 2 years, Ford had taken a fresh design concept and brought it to an extremely eager marketplace.
The Mustang really had a strong influence on the overall shape of the car, and obviously it was a very successful car. So from the Mustang on, concept cars were much more predictors of what the actual production cars would be. And that Mustang had a very strong influence on the actual production Mustang, which came out in 1965. Actually, it was a 65 introduced in 64, but it really had that effect on it.
I remember as a kid when I saw the first Mustang concept car, I was really impressed, and I thought at the time, well, if a company is doing things like that, I have to work for them. I have to try to do whatever is humanly possible from my side to be engaged in the Ford design team. And fortunately, I achieved it.
As the 1970s arrived with energy, environmental, and safety concerns, the genesis of Detroit concept cars gravitated toward world transportation issues and generally ceased to address the more light-handed pursuit of exterior design. Most concept cars were no longer excessively large or overly equipped with fanciful convenience features. Aerodynamics were now a primary objective when creating new shapes, as fuel economy became a prerequisite for any proposed concept. The marketplace was in a state of flux, and Detroit's designers and engineers were redirecting their roles from prophets of style to providers of solutions. The era of the think anything, try anything, do anything dream car was over. The Art Center School of Design in Pasadena, California, is but one of many colleges and universities in America where the young designers of tomorrow are learning to harness their imaginations into disciplined sources of contemporary form and function. It is here that the seeds of creativity being sown on drafting tables and sketch pads will someday shape the vehicles the world will be driving in the next century.
We work very strongly with the colleges, primarily as a training tool, because those are the designers of tomorrow, and we want to train them in the best ways we know how. So we want them to learn the language, the technology, but more importantly to be able to make good design. And so we do an awful lot of work with the colleges, and in now a lot of the supplier industry, a lot of the community will come in and tap that resource of the students to design and to do a number of things. And there's so much talent, and they do such a good job that you're starting to see that branch out a little bit, and I think that's wonderful. We've over the years done an awful lot of project programs with the schools, where we'll go in and we'll put together a hypothetical project or something that we're interested in exploring and turn them loose. And sometimes, even unbeknownst to them, we'll have a group inside working on the same things. So we'll try to use that as a learning tool for ourselves and as a learning tool for the students. But in the final analysis, we're trying to make everyone better, ourselves, as well as make a crop of students that we can select from better.
A car has to have soul, it has to have excitement. It's this ingredient X, whatever this ingredient X is. Nobody can put their finger on it, but they'll recognize it when they see it, the customer, the designer. And the designer has this passion that allows him or her to put that kind of feeling, that expression, that passion into a design of a car. It's an absolutely essential ingredient. If the car doesn't have that, it just won't make it. It won't be recognized on the road as being unique or different or special. And you can't tell where that ingredient X will ever come from or where that spark comes from. But when it happens, you recognize it, you know it, it's there, people want it, they buy it. And that's what this business is all about.
While the concept cars of 40 years ago rarely made the leap into regular production, the high-stakes game of global automotive relevance and bottom-line profits have in many ways altered the goals that today's manufacturers set for their styling and engineering think tanks. What today's concept cars provide to the industry is a constant variable.
I think for us today, they're trying to be a precursor to what we do tomorrow. Generally, there's a fairly strong thesis statement, whether in fact it's going to come to production or not. But our track record has been very good when you look at it as a company. The Viper, almost in its entirety, became the Viper, and of course Prowler and many others have had a significant contribution to what we've done with production platforms and production car programs. I think that's always been the case. When you go back to the days of Harley Earl at GM, where he did the Y job, for example, even though that vehicle didn't come into production, there were a number of elements that you later saw in some of their production vehicles. So I don't think the role has changed too much. We got away from it for years, but that's too bad. I think they're very important, and I think they're great opportunities to allow us as designers and engineers and marketing people to try to reach to find out what the icon and the images of our brands really are, and try to express ourselves in a better way.
I believe that today we have to be credible. You cannot do only styling exercise. You have to be close to manufacturing processes as possible, or use the concept car to develop new processes or try them. And also, I think it gives us the opportunity to stretch the envelope and see the reaction from the public, from the medias. Are we on the right way? Are we on the wrong way? It gives us, free of charge, a sort of feeling how good we could be.
And a very recent concept car that we did was the Contour show car, which we introduced here at the Detroit Auto Show about 3 years ago. And that had a very strong influence on the new Taurus that we just introduced.
We'll develop the concept car, and sometimes we'll startle and delight, or we'll do something that's quite unexpected with a concept car and then test the reaction, as opposed to asking people what they want, because a lot of times people will tell you all about today, but it isn't necessarily all that predictive. And if we're good designers, then perhaps we have the ability to at least express what we think may be an opportunity for the future, and then kind of listen to the customer. And a lot of times when we have the auto show, and on the first public days, I enjoy coming down and standing around the concept vehicles and standing around the new production vehicles and just listening to remarks, because sometimes that's the best way to get a really candid and honest feel for what people are thinking and what they say.
I think it's important also for a concept car to make the buyers or the respondents a little bit uncomfortable. If they're not uncomfortable with a concept car, a little uncomfortable, they've probably seen it before, and if they've seen it before, it's probably not a breakthrough design, and that's what we're really looking for, is something breakthrough, but good, and something saleable.
The far reaches of New Age automotive styling are being drawn along international boundaries. Here in Japan, the Toyota Idea Olympics is an annual exposition of startling innovation, where the saying, "anything goes," takes on a whole new significance. Much like the cadre of uninhibited designers of the 1950s, the free-spirited design students who compete in the Idea Olympics let their uncontaminated imaginations conceive otherworldly transportation devices. Like the dream cars of half a century ago, these 21st century counterparts represent the astonishing destinations that can be arrived at when there are no limits placed on creative vision. But what about today's high-ticket design professionals competing head-to-head in the worldwide marketplace? What kinds of limits are imposed on their visions of what might be?
Well, it's always a challenge because you have designers that are working with the same set of influences. We're in the same environment. We have a number of cultural factors working at the same time, and of course you have regulation. So all of these factors tend to shape the vehicle. And just beginning with regulation, for example, you have certain setbacks for bumpers, you have certain performance criteria, you have headlight criteria. All of these things are elements which tend to drive similarities. So as you get more and more regulation, then the challenge for us is to how to be able to drive ourselves apart and differentiate. And it is a challenge, and what we're trying to do is find a signature in terms of what we would have with what I call over-the-road graphics. When you look at a vehicle from a few hundred yards away, or you see it coming at you on the road, you say distinctively, I know that's a Dodge, or I know that's a Chrysler, or I know that's one of their cars. Or it may be the proportion. What we've done with Cab Forward, for example, makes our vehicles distinctive on the road. You look at them and you say, okay, I really can see that that's a little bit different. That is Chrysler. Hopefully they'll see that as progressive. And that's what we're trying to do.
Most concept cars, I think, today, I don't know, it's become kind of a world standard. I think most concept cars are expected to run. The press expects it, people who look at them expect it, the public expects it, and I think now, of course, the designers expect it. They want to see their car run. If they've committed to designing a concept car, then the engineering has to be there too, and the engineering community needs to be part of it, so that it's a holistic kind of a vehicle. It's not just simply a styling exercise, which might be nothing more than a fiberglass shell, or an engineering exercise, which would be maybe nothing more than just, say, an exotic mule. So I think in today's world, most concept cars are in fact engineered and serve at least a dual purpose of engineering and appearance.
In a changing world, technology and design must also travel in lockstep with the dynamics of progress. Far removed from the massive mastodons of the dream car age of the 50s, Honda's EPX high fuel efficiency design study tackles a litany of transportation questions that confront the demands of 21st century mobility. And yet, the heritage of the classic American dream car and the wellspring of technology that defines the modern approach to automobiles may both be represented in one of Ford's most recent concepts, the Lincoln Sentinel.
The direction that I gave the designers on this car was to come up with something that was immediately identifiable as a Lincoln. We wanted a next generation, full-size luxury car, full interior, full luggage capacity, with the performance of a luxury car today, meeting the fuel economy standards, et cetera, that we need in that kind of a car. Now that was about the direction that I gave them, but I did say I wanted that car to be immediately identifiable as a Lincoln, without any badging on it, without any lettering, any nomenclature whatsoever. I want that car to look like a Lincoln. So let's understand what a Lincoln really is. Now that's the direction that I gave them, and they went back and did their research and understood what was best in Lincolns over the year, what really, and I mean over, way back to the early Lincoln Zephyrs. And you'll see, I think you'll see indications of a number of different Lincolns in this car, but they're all cues that were specifically associated with Lincoln over the years, right down from the front end of the car, which has a very contemporary interpretation of a Lincoln Zephyr grille, which happens to have the turn indicators built into the grille texture. So these are all different variations on a theme, but I also made it very clear that I did not want a retro car. This is not supposed to be a retro car. This is a new car. It's contemporary, but I want, if you will, a contemporary classic. And the other direction that I gave on this car was I want this car to win the Concours d'Elegance at Pebble Beach 50 years down the road.
Which brings us full circle. The collection of dream cars here at Pebble Beach are but a handful of survivors from the over 250 estimated dream cars built by the Big Three during the 1950s and 60s. Joe Bortz from Highland Park, Illinois, owns many of the dream cars filling the Pebble Beach display. As a collector of these rare automotive artifacts, he is all too familiar with the fate that many of the other dream cars have met.
Each car had a crush order on it, and mainly it was for insurance reasons. The cars were not tested, and if they got in the hands of a private party and they had an accident, of course they would be exposed, the manufacturers would be exposed to all the liability conditions of any other car, and not being tested, they had an extreme exposure just in that area. So they decided that the safest way for them would be to crush the cars, and that was mainly General Motors and Ford. Chrysler had another idea, and they thought that some of the cars could be sold in countries where their legal liabilities would be reduced because of the time and distance with the other countries.
Many of our cars languished in warehouses for years and got dustier and dustier, and of course eventually pieces fell off of them, just part of the aging process. Most of the warehouses of course were not heated year-round, so the expansion and contraction, the moisture condensation and then evaporation, just like any aging process, takes its toll. You know, we all eventually have that happen to us, cars and people alike. And I think they were just simply lost. They were scrapped, as you know. There's been stories in magazines about some of them turning up out here at War Hoops, which is a salvage yard out a few miles north of here, and lucky collectors finding them. This happened a few years back. But many of them, alas, really were scrapped, went to the chopper, and that's a sad thing indeed. Some of our scale models, beautiful, exquisite scale models that were built for many years to test out ideas before we committed to the full-size cars, went to the warehouse and again languished for years and eventually went to the chopper. Hate to say it, but it's still going on. It still happens today.
The 1955 Chrysler Falcon Ghia, the 1956 Dodge Dart, which became the Dodge Diablo in 1957, the 1953 Chrysler d'Elegance, the 1954 Dodge Fire Arrow Roadster, the 1954 Plymouth Belmont, the 1956 Packard Panther. Now, looked upon by some as the automotive equivalent of sideshow curiosities, they were once signposts to tomorrow. Cars that took us inside the minds of our most brilliant designers, while at the same time taking us beyond the horizons of our own perceptions of the possible. What few of them remain can still challenge the eye and test our readiness to accept new things. And as the world expands into new areas of discovery that continue to reduce the distance between fantasy and reality almost daily, there is still much we can learn in the lessons being spoken by the dreams of steel.